probably finish chapter 1, hopefully. I've been saying that for a few days now, but there's lots of nectar in chapter 1. So. Is it better now? Okay. Haribol Jai. Like that? Jai. Okay, so then last week we were beginning towards the end, we were beginning the bibliography of a few select Goswamis. This isn't an extensive list, of course. Even as we read here, when we get to Rupa Goswami, some famous texts like Hamsadutta and Uddhav Sandesh are not included. But this is still some prominent texts which Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur feels are worthy of utilization for glorification. So we discussed 4 texts from Sanatana Goswami, two commentaries, Hari Bhakti Vilas and Shri Brihad Bhagavatamrita. And now we are going to go, as Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur gives a nice segue. We've already given the names of 4 books compiled by Sanatana Goswami. Similarly, Srila Rupa Goswami has also compiled many books, which no one can even count. I shall therefore enumerate the chief books compiled by Srila Rupa Goswami. He has described the pastimes of Vrindavan in 100,000 verses. The books compiled by Sri Rupa Goswami include the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Vidagdha Madhava, Ujjvala Nilamani, and Lalita Madhava. Srila Rupa Goswami has also compiled the Danakeli Kaumudi, Stavavali, Lila Chanda, Padyavali, Govinda Virudavali, Mathura Mahatmya, and Nataka Varnana. So, I will speak mainly about the first 4 listed. The remaining, Danakeli Kaumudi, is a 1-act play. It's very rasic and therefore is I haven't read it because of that, and in general it's not recommended for that text to be read rather early on. Same with not same with Stavavali. Stavavali, Lila Chanda Padyavali, Govinda Virudavali, these valis are collections of poetry, so they are somewhat self-explanatory. Mathura Mahatmya is then a glorification of Mathura Dham, because as we know there's the Panchanga Bhakti, we have the list of 9 forms of devotional service, but there's another list given in Caitanya Caritamrita, and one of the great ones is to dwell in Mathura Dham. So what exactly that entails, what it means to be a denizen of Mathura, that is elaborated on and explained by Rupa Goswami in Mathura Mahatmya. Okay, but text 38, so there's 4 texts given here. And these are rather famous texts. Most of us, well, everyone here, but most of the devotees listening will have heard of Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, Vidagdha Madhava, Ujjvala Nilamani, and Lalita Madhava. The way they're listed is a little interesting because each one of these texts sort of come in duos, but they're sort of split up. So, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which we all know, Srila Prabhupada has given us the wonderful summary study, the Nectar of Devotion. But Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, this correlates, I should have written BRS, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, that correlates with Ujjvala Nilamani. These 2 texts go together as a pair. They're very similar in their style and in their topics. And in fact, Ujjvala Nilamani was largely seen as an elaboration by Rupa Goswami on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. What he felt was lacking in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, he elaborated on in Ujjvala Nilamani. Then we have the pair of Vidagdha Madhava and Lalita Madhava. So, these 2 are both plays. Rupa Goswami was very fond of writing plays, as were most of the 6 Goswamis, coming from very cultured backgrounds. They had rather cultured artistic prowess, and so they very much liked to express that in plays. Something that was continued by Tamal Krishna Goswami. He also composed a few plays, which were very sweet. One about the pastimes of Jagannath, and a few others, I think. But the most prominent one is the one about Jagannath. There's a few pastimes that have been rendered in an artistic form as plays. So, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, as we know, Srila Prabhupada gives us the summary study of the Nectar of Devotion. And Dhanudhar Swami has written his great commentary, Waves of Devotion, which is pulling out some further points which were maybe summarized rather strongly in Prabhupada's Nectar of Devotion, just to see what Prabhupada includes everything that we need to know from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu in Nectar of Devotion. However, books like Waves of Devotion and then of course Bhanu Maharaj's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu are only there so that things which are implicit and maybe we cannot see are made a bit more explicit. But actually Srila Prabhupada's Nectar of Devotion is a very wonderful study. And as I mentioned, Rupa Goswami, like his brothers, were very educated and cultured people. Rejected as they were by Hindu society, they were still in an aristocratic setting and would have been exposed to a lot of the great culture of the time. So with that aristocracy, there was a great knowledge of the various ideas of rasa and artistic theories. And what we find in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is a very, very interesting application of rasa theory, which was also an independent thing prior to Rupa Goswami's seeing all of it being present in the pastimes of Krishna. We see Rupa Goswami is sort of discovering or unveiling these notions to us. So before, the Rasa Shastras were mainly books. They weren't Rasik books, so to speak, in the sense that we normally think of them. They were actually books detailing the different types of rasa. So there's things like Shringa Rasa, Hasya Rasa, Viraha Rasa, so the heroic rasa, there's the humorous rasa. All these different flavors or types of experience were listed. One of the most prominent one was the Natya Shastras, written by Bharat Muni. And it's actually described in the histories that Bharat Muni was a sage, and he was trying to figure out what's a way that I can overcome this issue of the pride of humanity. So many people now, as the ages are going on, are being filled with pride and they're not being able to focus themselves. And so it said the demigods channeled the knowledge of Natya Shastra to him, and then he compiled them, so that through the method of artistic means, humans can have higher messages conveyed to them and have their humility be captured more by having a means of communicating to them which will maybe grab them more immediately. So this sort of rasa theory is a ordained one. It is not to say a secular thing that was then used to contribute to the understanding of the Shastras. It's something that was there, and then the genius of Rupa Goswami, who revealed many different things that were not revealed before through his study. It's not that he created something new, but rather uncovered something that had gone somewhat unnoticed before. So, in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, there's a great application of this rasa theory. And that's why we see also beyond that, we see also a description of the whole spiritual life. It's a very practical text. As most of us have gone through the Nectar of Devotion, we know it's describing the whole sort of varieties of spiritual life, and then again, all the rasas present in the various pastimes, so on and so forth. Ujjvala Nilamani is a more interesting, is a bit more new, because we don't hear it often, and that is for good reason. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur rather famously did not allow a lot of his disciples to ever read it. So he would tell some of them, just never read it. Anything that you can get from it, get by realization. I don't want you to risk running in too quickly. If you wait, maybe it'll take you a little longer to discover it, but at least by realization you'll discover these things. Because Ujjvala Nilamani was written, of course he didn't say that to all his disciples, but it was an instruction he often gave. And Ujjvala Nilamani focuses very strongly then on that Madhurya rasa. Rupa Goswami felt a little dissatisfied maybe with his description of it in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. As we know, all the rasas are perfect, but Madhurya rasa gives the greatest joy. Madhurya rasa, in a sense, is the most perfect, or the most ecstatic. For each individual devotee, their rasa is perfect for them, but if one takes a third-party view, it is the Madhurya rasa that has the deepest exchanges of love. And therefore, Ujjvala Nilamani was written by Rupa Goswami to sort of elaborate on these topics. And because it is elaborating on these very, very high topics, and this is a theme we'll find throughout looking over these books, it was said that it is better not to jump into that text, which is why, of course, it is a little less known than Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which is very appropriate for devotees at all stages to know where they're going. So these two texts are rather philosophical in a practical way, but they are they are identifying tattva, the philosophy of rasa maybe, but still philosophical nevertheless. Vidagdha Madhava and Lalita Madhava, on the other hand, are plays. And originally they were one play. The pastime goes that Rupa Goswami, after meeting Mahaprabhu in Prayag, he went off to travel to Puri, where the other devotees were going. And as he was going there, his brother, Anupama, or Vallabha, who is the father of Jiva Goswami, who we will read as the last author that Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur seeks to glorify, as he was going, this brother of his left his body in around Bengal. So he had to situate himself there. Situating himself there, he decided to begin writing some poetry or some plays. So he decided to write one play, which would later become these two plays. And writing these, he was absorbed in that. And then once his stopping in the Bengal area was finished, he was no longer held up by having to do the needful with his deceased brother. He continued on his journey to Puri. And on the way, he stopped in a town called Satyabhampura, where Satyabhama, one of the wives of Krishna, appears to him very beautifully in a dream, because she knows that he's writing a poem which he is hoping to delve into, particularly this topic of the wives of Krishna and things like this. So she is knowing he's writing this play. And while he is staying there, before he enters into Jagannath Puri, she appears to him in a dream, very beautiful. And she tells him, please, you are writing this wonderful play, write another play as well, so you can glorify the relations that I had with Krishna as well. So if you could do this as well, I would be very pleased, and I'm instructing you to do this. And so Rupa Goswami, he remembered this, and it was in his mind as he entered into Jagannath Puri. And then while he was in Jagannath Puri, he was still thinking about how he will write this. And then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu once, because he is Sarvagya, he knows what's going on. Krishna actually is described. He is described as Sarvagya and as Mugdha. These are the two terms to describe Krishna's knowledge. He is simultaneously Sarvagya, knowing all, and he is simultaneously also Mugdha, illusioned, not knowing things. Because, of course, this is how Krishna's pastimes can be made sweet. Krishna, at times, with his yoga maya, he will know everything that's going on. He'll know the hearts of everyone. And at other times, he'll be worried that Jashoda might actually get him or might put him in trouble. It's said that in the Damodar, not in the Damodar Lila, in the Lila where Gopal opens his mouth, and Mother Jashoda, she sees all the universes and all, and she's about to leave. It's said that Krishna's worry wasn't so much, oh no, what if my devotee leaves? His worry was more, who's going to hug me if she runs away? Again, this is an example. At times, Krishna, he will become ignorant of his position. Not ignorant in the avidya sense, but ignorant in the mugdha sense. It is not an ignorance caused by Mahamaya, but an ignorance caused by Yogamaya, to intensify the sweetness of his relations. So this is mugdha, and this is sarvagya. And Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he is Krishna himself. So the same quality is there. To know everything, to be omniscient, is a quality of Krishna, and Mahaprabhu has it as well. So knowing this, he goes to Rupa Goswami, and he is speaking to Rupa Goswami. And almost non-contextually, he says, do not ever let Krishna leave Vrindavan. He says, Krishna does not want to leave Vrindavan, nor can he. That Krishna who is outside, that is another Krishna, that is Vasudeva Krishna. This Krishna, he is another person. You can let him leave Vrindavan. But Krishna himself, that original, that Krishna in his fullness, do not let him leave. He cannot leave. And then Mahaprabhu continues on, and Rupa Goswami in his heart, he's having this, he's sort of thinking, well, you know, that's pretty impressive. He knew exactly what I was thinking. He knew my heart. He knew that I was deliberating on what was this message that I had received before I entered Jagannath Puri. So with this in his mind, he then wrote two separate texts, because he realized this concept of rasabhas. There is rasa, and then there is abhas. In the same way that we have namabhas, where it is a semblance of the name, there's rasabhas, where something seems to follow the rules of rasa, but by violating it, it cannot be considered genuine rasa. By breaking this mood, then it is not proper rasa, and it is not encourageable in Shastras. We were discussing before in Kurukshetra how the gopis, their hearts are broken when they're seeing Krishna in his Vasudev form as a ruler, the ruler of Dwarka. In a sense, the same thing was being done, except it was not done in a way that was intensifying their love or intensifying the glory of their love. Actually, all this did was cause a play, which again, we know Rupa Goswami is an expert in rasa, but it was not following the proper rules of rasa. And that's why both were split into two. So Vidagdha Madhava is discussing pastimes in Vrindavan. And Lalita Madhava is discussing pastimes in Dwarka. And that's why the two were split. And then, of course, Vidagdha Madhava is very famous. In Vidagdha Madhava, when Rupa Goswami then, he started getting writing. He was writing and writing and writing. And Mahaprabhu one day, he was walking past, and Mahaprabhu said, "What are you writing?" And Rupa Goswami, he showed what he was writing. And Mahaprabhu read a little bit. And reading a tiny bit, he said, "The handwriting of Rupa Goswami is like a string of pearls. It is so beautiful, it is so wonderful." And then as he read a little further, he read on, and he read that famous text that we all know. When I chant, Krishna seems to dance on my tongue. And with him dancing, I would want millions and millions of tongues so that I could relish that sweetness. And then upon hearing that name dancing on my tongues, I could have millions and millions of ears in order to relish the sound of it. With all of this having had completed, then Krishna dances in the courtyard of my heart. This famous verse Mahaprabhu read out. And hearing this, Haridas Thakur, who was also in Jagannath Puri at the time, began ecstatically dancing. He was dancing and dancing. And then, doing this, he was very excited. And then as the pastimes went along, Mahaprabhu then, in the company of Rupa Goswami and Haridas Thakur, they ran into Ramananda Rai. And Mahaprabhu was so pleased with this text that then he said, please, Rupa Goswami, repeat this wonderful composition you have made that can so much fulfill the heart of anyone who hears it. And Ramananda Rai, upon hearing it, he says, "This is wonderful." He said, "This is amazing." All the devotees were filled in ecstasy. And then after the ecstasies were complete, Ramananda Rai, he said, from what is this composition? From which text have you found this? And then Rupa Goswami explained. He explained the whole pastime that actually I had intended to compose one text, but instead, on the wish of Mahaprabhu, I had split them into two. So these are the two. These two texts. That is how they came to be. Again, their contents are somewhat esoteric, somewhat elevated, so we won't go into it too much. Then we already talked a little bit about the remaining books of Rupa Goswami. However, there's one left, which Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur seeks to glorify the remaining texts with. He says, "Who can count the rest of the books, headed by the Laghu Bhagavatamrita, written by Srila Rupa Goswami?" So here we have a text called the Laghu Bhagavatamrita. And this is the last text that Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur seeks to glorify Rupa Goswami with. We are familiar with the term Bhagavatamrita. As we know, Sanatana Goswami has composed the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. The Brihad Bhagavatamrita was composed by Sanatana Goswami with the assumption that people will accept that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That Krishna, he is Swayam Bhagavan. He doesn't really go in to assert that truth. He doesn't go in to try and prove this doctrinal point. He instead assumes that anyone reading this will have enough intelligence to realize that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Instead, he is describing the variations of devotees of Krishna and all the various grades, but he does not actually go out to prove this. Unfortunately, it is not the case that everyone has the level of insight to realize that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And so, Rupa Goswami has written this Laghu, this small Bhagavatamrita, in order to supplement and complement the conclusions of the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. So again, as I said when we discussed the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, sometimes people think that because it is the Amrit, the nectar of the Bhagavat, it is the Bhagavatamrita, therefore it will be going over and summarizing all the pastimes. But it is not an Amrit of Ras, of Lila, but it is an Amrit of Tattva. It is going through the conclusions of philosophy, but not necessarily the actual pastimes of themselves. In a similar way, the Laghu Bhagavatamrita, it's not that if one doesn't want to read the whole Bhagavatam, they can read the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and then if they don't want to read the Brihad Bhagavatamrita because it's too long, they can read the Laghu Bhagavatamrita. In one sense, they will get a lot of the philosophical conclusions, but these texts are not non-different in that sense. They are merely taking nectar from each other and presenting it. So the Laghu Bhagavatamrita itself is mainly composed of this idea of explaining, very relevant to Ghanesham Prabhu's class yesterday, the majority of avatar tattva is described in this text, all the various incarnations, and then all of how they relate, what is the relationship of Narasimha Dev, Ramachandra, all of the various Chaturvyuha avatars, who are the Guna avatars, who are the Lila avatars. All these categories are discussed in Laghu Bhagavatamrita. And again, to show the difference, the conversation of Brihad Bhagavatamrita is between Parikshit Maharaj and his mother, whereas the more central conversation of Laghu Bhagavatamrita is between Prashna Muni and Maitreya. So these two are discussing. So it's a very different flavor than Parikshit Maharaj and his mother. And so there's many different discussions here, and then later on, it's described a few proofs. So there's a description of all the various avatars, and then there's a very intensive refutation of incorrect notions of who Krishna is. So the idea that maybe Krishna is an incarnation of Vishnu, this is refuted. Maybe an idea that Krishna is an incarnation of Narayan, this also is refuted. And he does so shastrically and also logically. There's a very interesting logical proof Gopi Paranadhana Prabhu mentioned, because sometimes people will say, this idea that the Gauriya Vaishnavas have, that Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, that Bhagavan is more complete than Brahman. Because how could this be? One object, how could one object have one aspect that is greater, but still be that same thing? How could Brahman be Bhagavan, but Bhagavan be more complete? And so he says in a refutation, in the same way when one sees an object, the sense perception you get from touch, or the sense perception you get from sight, or the sense perception you get from hearing, these are all various incomplete sense perceptions of the whole thing. It is only when it has passed through the sense of the mind that one gets a complete conception. This does not mean that the object changes, but still, nevertheless, the perception of the object does change. In the same way, when the transcendentalist approaches the Supreme Personality, depending on the way his senses, or the completion or the completeness of the way he is approaching that person, he will have different experiences from it. Therefore, again, if one is approaching through the jnana process, they will perceive through that sense maybe only Brahman. If they're going through the yoga process, then maybe they will, through those senses, realize Paramatma. But if one uses the fullest, most complete system of Shuddha Bhakti, that is like the complete concept of mind when one sees an object. When that happens, then one has seen the complete thing. It is not contradictory to say that Brahman and Bhagavan are one and the same, and yet Bhagavan is greater than the Brahman. So various ideas like these are explained in the Laghu Bhagavatamrita. And so this list is complete. So Rupa Goswami, this is the list given by Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur, and we go on then to Srila Rupa Goswami's nephew, who is the son of the Anupama we were discussing earlier on. So we'll wipe this off. So again, this list is not complete. There are many texts like Udhav Sandesh, Hamsadutta, various other shastras that are not mentioned in this list, but Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur does not intend to list them all, which is why he finishes with all of the texts headed by Laghu Bhagavatamrita. Then we go to Jiva Goswami. So Jiva Goswami is again the nephew of Rupa and Sanatan, and we hear that he has compiled so many books on devotional service that there is no counting them. So again, we find a similar concept. We're going to hear some texts that he has composed, but we are not going to hear them all. So we begin with the Bhagavat Sandarbha. The Bhagavat Sandarbha is an interesting text. The Bhagavat Sandarbha is actually a collection of 6 books, well, actually 7, technically speaking. There is a 7th Sandarbha. A Sandarbha is like a treatise or an essay, and they very much read like this, each one of them. Each one of these texts reads strongly like an essay. When you go through, Jiva Goswami, he takes a topic, and there's 6 topics described. And we'll go through the list quickly of he titles which topic he wishes to dive into, and then he goes through and he makes a point, gives Shastric references, elaborates on the philosophy, gives Shastric references, then goes on to his next point. And it's very systematic. There's no more systematic or overview of the Gauriya Vedanta philosophy than the Satsandarbhas. It goes through again. Whereas other texts were written maybe to elaborate on a pastime or on a specific topic or maybe just for a specific mission. The point of the Bhagavad Sandarbhas, also called the Satsandarbhas sometimes because there are 6 of them, the main point of it is to lay out the entirety of the Gauriya Vaishnava philosophy and with Shastric Praman from the Vedas, from Shastra, with evidence to show that not only is our philosophy logical, not only is it conclusive, but it is also deeply Shastric. Some people might say, these Hare Krishna devotees, they're dancing around, they're singing, they're chanting, they're crying, they're doing all these things. They're just sentimentalists. The whole idea is they make you feel good, and then this is it, you know? You jump on board because, as we know, there's the concept of Yukta Vairagya, and there's also the concept of Niyamagraha. Sometimes there is this idea that the whole point of any rule is to cultivate love for Godhead. It is to cultivate love for Krishna. People might say, people are just drawn to this because they see, oh, here are these people, they don't care too much for the rules. They just like to be happy, and that's why they're doing it. There's no philosophy behind it. They just like an ideology where they can switch around whatever they want, and then switching it around, they don't need to be so strict. But this is the point of texts like Bhagavad Sandarbha. Also, Govinda Bhashya by Baladev Vidyabhushan is written for a similar reason. To legitimize that actually it is not sentimentalism. Sentimentalism is empty and pointless. The conclusions of the devotional path and of Gauriya Vedanta are thoroughly logical, thoroughly Shastric. It is after a conclusion of Shastric study that one comes to our conclusions. Maybe there will be an experience of the great relishability of the holy name. But still, even if one enters through philosophy, one will not find that there is any conclusion lacking in the Gauriya Vedanta. Indra Prabhu would often make this point. If anyone can speak of being of a great relisher of the ecstasies of devotional life, Indra Prabhu is one of the greats. His great appreciation for the holy name is very much appreciated all around the world in every single devotee community. However, he himself would often say, we have the greatest philosophy. We cannot let people forget that our philosophy is the greatest philosophy. We cannot allow sentimentalism to be the main thrust of our prachar, of our preaching. Because if sentimentalism becomes the foundation of our spiritual life, then the foundation is the thing which we carry upon, we build upon it. And a foundation of sentimentalism is too shaky and too shallow. So again, Shastric study is so central to our line, and Jiva Goswami is greatly embodying this in his Bhagavad Sandarbha, which is a very conclusive overview of our entire spiritual path. So, the Bhagavad Sandarbha, it begins with the Tattva Sandarbha. I won't go too much, because of time constraints, I won't go too much into which each one entails, but the Tattva Sandarbha is the shortest. It's very small. But in many ways, it has some of the greater conclusions, because tattva, of course, is truth. And its study is what we call an epistemological one. It has to do with epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. What is an actual valid source of knowledge? So concepts of like pratyaksha, anuman, and shabda, what are the different levels of the Shastras? These are all described in Tattva Sandarbha, and the whole thing is essentially like a ramp leading up to the conclusion that in Bhagavatam there is all truth. If one comes to that conclusion, then they've come to the whole conclusion of Tattva Sandarbha. But again, Jiva Goswami has written this to convince people philosophically. But essentially, the whole point of this is then that Tattva Sandarbha, this is that Srimad Bhagavatam, it is the highest source of knowledge. There is no greater source of knowledge than the Srimad Bhagavatam. So there is that. Then the next one is Bhagavat Sandarbha. Bhagavat Sandarbha is mainly dealing with the nature of Bhagavan. So we'll see here refutation, delineation on the notions of the distinction between the Brahman effulgence and Bhagavan, things like this. It's rather what is, because Prabhupada mentions here that Shuddha Sattva is described. The impersonalists will sometimes say that Shuddha Sattva means still material conditioning. It is not transcendental. Shuddha Sattva just means something is purely in the mode of goodness. But the mode of goodness is still a material mode. And so Jiva Goswami explains that this is a transcendental goodness. This is another mode of existence. It is not material. Ideas like this are delineated upon. Then, after the Bhagavat Sandarbha, we have the Paramatma Sandarbha. The Paramatma, we most often use the word Paramatma to refer to the super soul in the heart, the Kshirodakashayi Vishnu. But actually, Paramatma can refer to any of the Vishnu incarnations. Paramatma just generally refers to Krishna when he is taking his role of maintaining the material universe. So the three Paramatmas are the three Vishnus. So Karanodakashayi Vishnu, in a sense, is also a Paramatma. Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, who is inside our material universe, he is also a Paramatma. And then, of course, Kshirodakashayi Vishnu in our hearts, he is also Paramatma. And each one is to be considered the super soul on three different levels. So there's a super soul of each individual atom, each individual person. There's a super soul of each universe. And then there's a super soul of all the universes. And so all of these topics are being described. He goes in a long depth. I remember listening to a seminar by Bhanu Swami in it. And the fact that I can't remember much, it really reflects how intense it was. He just went quickly, boom, 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 boom. All these different philosophical points on what is the exact nature of time? How is time different when the universe is being created? What is a material effect? What is a spiritual effect? All these very intricate points about how Bhagavan or Krishna in the form of Vishnu relates to the material world in its manifestation. All these sort of things are described in Paramatma Sandarbha. Then the next is Krishna Sandarbha. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's just, it's not just, but it's a great explanation of the position of Krishna, Krishna's qualities, who is Krishna, what are Krishna's pastimes like, what is the philosophical, the tattva prachar, what is the philosophical conclusion of the nature of Krishna. And then there is the Bhakti Sandarbha. This has to do with the various types of devotional service. What is devotional service? We'll see here concepts like Arupa Siddhi Bhakti, Swarupa Siddha Bhakti, and Sangha Siddha Bhakti, the different types of bhakti that's maybe imposed. You'll have ideas like devotion, something, and there might be an action which is not inherently devotional, but because it is done for a devotional service. Like chopping down wood is not necessarily part of a yajna, but it is a part of a yajna when you're using that wood in order to perform a yajna. So therefore, it has had an imposition. Aropa means accusation or imposition. It might have a bhakti imposed onto it. Then you have things like Sangha Siddha Bhakti. It's exactly what it sounds like, Sangha. Through the association, it is kind of bhakti. So even though it isn't inherently bhakti itself, it is inherent to bhakti. It's the cultivation of qualities like peaceful mindedness, a lack of hatred, a lack of unfounded hatred. Obviously, we know hatred can be very spiritual in the cases of Hanuman, so on and so forth. But these things are inherent to the development of spiritual life, even if they aren't inherently bhakti themselves. They have Sangha Siddha Bhakti, and then you have Swarupa Siddha Bhakti, which is the most straightforward. Things that are straightforward, directly bhakti, chanting, archan, praying, things like this. So we'll hear stuff like this. Then, I don't have time to go through all of it, but it describes all these different various types of bhakti. He'll discuss the 9 forms of bhakti by Prahlad Maharaj. It's just an extensive discussion on this. Then lastly comes the Priti Sandarbha, which is discussing directly love for Godhead. So it's a little different in that it's discussing that love which is gained from bhakti, whereas bhakti is more referring to like the actual path. Priti, in a sense, is discussing the prayojan, if you will. It sort of bleeds over a little bit, but this sandarbha would be more a discussion of the prayojana, whereas this one is a bit more a discussion of the abhideya. So these are the 6, and there's also a 7th one that's mentioned, called the Krama Sandarbha. Prabhupada doesn't mention it here, but it is sometimes included in this list. That's just a Bhagavatam commentary, which is heavily based on these. Because as we can imagine, the Tattva Sandarbha spends a lot of time saying Bhagavatam is the greatest proof. There is no greater Shastric evidence. There's no greater evidence in anything besides quoting Srimad Bhagavatam. So Bhagavatam is very thoroughly being quoted throughout the entire Sandarbha. So in order to incorporate a lot of that, Jiva Goswami sort of did the reverse. He used sort of a lot of the philosophies from the Sandarbhas to comment on Bhagavatam. So that's sometimes included as a seventh, but it's not really part of the general flow of the text. But yeah, just for completion's sake, I mentioned it. I won't write it because I'm about to just erase it all. But yeah. So then lastly, we have the description of the most famous and formidable transcendental literature is the book named Gopal Champu. In this book, the internal pastimes of the Lord are established, and the transcendental mellows enjoyed in Vrindavan are completely described. This text here, Gopal Champu, is part of the genre called Champu. It's so the Champu genre is a genre of Sanskrit texts in which it is prose, so it is prosaic, it is in narrative form, but it uses a heavy utilization of poetic techniques. So even though it'll maybe jump to poetry rather quickly, it's intersped a lot, or it uses an extensive amount of poetic techniques that aren't normally present in works of prose. So Gopal Champu is written by Jiva Goswami, and it's somewhat interesting for a few reasons, which I think tie in very well to an attitude that should be had, especially when discussing a lot of the Goswami literature, a lot of these esoteric things, which are a bit, Prabhupada obviously was very heavy on this. In fact, speaking of Vidagdha Madhava, Prabhupada would often say he went to a conference once, because at the time, some of his godbrothers were in their preaching mission. He mentioned they were printing a lot of these esoteric books and just giving them out. That was a lot of what they were doing. And Prabhupada was saying it was pointless. What are they doing? Giving out all these high literatures is like, there's a saying, putting pearls before swine. The swine won't be able to know what they're seeing. So Prabhupada was saying like this, and he said he actually went to a conference, a scholarly conference, and he was speaking to these scholars, and they were talking, oh, you know, you are a sannyasi in the line of, I don't think he was a sannyasi at the time, but you're a devotee in the line of Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You are following in the footsteps of Rupa Goswami. We have studied and read a lot about Vidagdha Madhava, the play we were discussing by Rupa Goswami. However, Prabhupada said all that he heard was some of the most revolting things that had ever touched his ears. Rather than seeing these transcendental topics, they spoke about it as if it was a commentary on sex and romantic psychology. All they said was, it reminds me even at university. We were going through in one comparative literature class, and they were discussing about the Bhagavatam. And the whole thesis that we were exposed to of the Bhagavatam is that Bhagavatam is a work of early feminist literature. All of these great transcendental concepts are boiled down to a civil issue on the material plane. Irregardless of what your thoughts on feminism are, that is a complete degradation of the transcendental conclusions of Srimad Bhagavatam. They took all of the esoteric parts of 10th canto and said this is all feminist rhetoric. So revolting things like this are the result of a too eager dissemination of texts like this. And yeah, Srila Prabhupada said, he said it was useless. Their reading of Vidagdha Madhava was more than useless because it was offensive, because they came to these conclusions. So such texts, again, even though they're given for a reason, it's not like they are fully banned, they still must be entered into with hesitancy. So Gopal Champu is interesting because Gopal Champu is a description of Krishna's pastimes. It's very big. Bhanu Swami has written a translation. I have not read it, but I've seen it being sold, and it's something like this large. And the whole thing builds up to the marriage of Krishna and the gopis. They all get married at the end. And this has caused some slight stir on a very, very elevated topic of the Swakiya versus Parakiya. Because I'm pretty sure in Adi Lila it's discussed a tiny bit, that there's Svakiya Rasa versus Parakiya Rasa, which ties in again into the two Krishnas. There is the Krishna of Dwarka and there's the Krishna of Vrindavan. In Dwarka, Krishna enjoys the Svakiya Rasa, the married Rasa. But in Vrindavan, he enjoys the Parakiya Rasa, or the unmarried Rasa. So it seems a bit confusing that Jiva Goswami has included a description of Krishna being married in Vrindavan when Vrindavan is meant to be the place where he is enjoying the Parakiya Rasa. And in fact, the Prakrita Sahajiyas, the very common enemies of ours, the people who don't really contribute anything and in fact contribute a lot quite negatively, have jumped upon this. And in fact, the Prakrita Sahajiyas, they will take some of our texts and they will diminish the position of Jiva Goswami. And they will say things like, because Jiva Goswami was preaching this Svakiya Rasa, this married Rasa, even in Vrindavan, that is why, because when Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur mentions in Caitanya Caritamrita, he mentions the devotees who have requested for him to write this book, he will not mention Jiva Goswami often. And they'll say stuff like this, and they'll say, therefore Jiva Goswami, he did not have a good relationship with Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur. There was a division. We are following Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur. We are following very correctly, and then they go off and do all their nonsense. But actually, this itself is unfounded. If anyone has been, to the Samadhi of Rupa Goswami, when you enter there is also the Samadhi of Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur. Tradition has it that Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur was there with Jiva Goswami when he was leaving his body. That reflects some degree of cordiality, which may be a slight lack of mention in the requests for writing the Caitanya Caritamrita in the Caitanya Caritamrita don't really balance out. That seems to be a very small and minute point. So in actuality, they were having a very good relation, as we can see. Why would he glorify Jiva Goswami in this text if they did not have a good relation? But they will emphasize this point because they see it as a great point that why is Jiva Goswami propagating the Svakiya Rasa? And the reason why is because in the context, this was not something that really, that most people are either qualified to hear, and if they do hear it, it can be almost revolting for some people, not understanding the intimate relation. Because in one sense, the gopis are Svakiya. Svakiya means to be one's own. And in this sense, they are the Shaktis of the Shaktiman of Krishna. They are the one of the own of Krishna. Krishna is having a Svakiya relationship with them, in Tattva. But in Rasa, Prabhupada writes that the mood is generally one of Parakiya, of the unmarried Rasa. So, then again, why this? Because some people, after hearing that, they will find it to be off-putting, and then they will think offensive thoughts. Furthermore, some people just aren't even qualified at all to know that this notion is there. So Jiva Goswami has done the very famous notion of a preaching strategy. He's done a preaching strategy because these people are not, we should take this as an understanding. These pastimes, these very rasic pastimes, are such a highly qualified thing that Jiva Goswami felt the need to obscure them for a bit because of how disqualified audiences can be to enter into them. This is why he stressed the Svakiya Rasa. And it's said, he writes elsewhere that he has written like this as a preaching strategy. And then it makes an interesting point that the Sahajiyas will jump on this and they will say, he is not in line with Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur, therefore we reject him. They are rejecting him. Why? Because he is preaching the Svakiya Rasa. The very means which Jiva Goswami used to protect the Sahajiyas from their own damning behaviors, those very means are the means that the Sahajiyas used to reject him. Very ungrateful recipients of his mercy. So again, this should be a reminder that these topics, Bhaktividya Purana Swami says, at a time maybe someone will become ready, very, very later on in their spiritual life, to enter into such literatures. But he says the majority of people aren't. He says the majority of people are like excited teenage girls who will always take photos of themselves doing this or that and share it with everyone on Facebook or Snapchat or whatever, because they don't actually care about what they're doing. They just want everyone else to see that they're doing this. Many people will enter in like that. They will hear Madhavan, His Grace Madhavananda Prabhu says, this is one of the greatest issues in one's spiritual life. Bhakta Bob, who has joined ISKCON 6 months ago, before then he didn't know who Krishna was. He is in Radha Kund saying the Radha Sahasranam, but he has not even read Nectar of Instruction or Ishopanishad. So because of this, these texts, they are there, but they should not be rushed into. Again, so many people will make a big deal of it, like Bhaktivedanta Purnaswami very funnily says, like a teenage girl, all excited, wanting to show off. But when that genuine, mature realization is there, it is not something that is flaunted around. And Prabhupada will make this point when we get into chapter 2 tomorrow, discussing the signs of Mahabhav. So many people want to make a great show of devotion, a great show of advancement. But these items are very damaging if they are used in that way. They are meant to be served, not used to serve one's image or one's intellectual curiosity. It is not a book that one can read just because they're curious, just because they want to know something, just for some mental sense gratification. Again, and in order to protect people who may not have that strong idea, Jiva Goswami has written Gopal Champu as, in some sense, preaching Swakiya Bhav. But we can understand the later acharyas have explained this was a preaching strategy. It was used for this purpose. Bhanu Maharaj gave a wonderful seminar on this because he translated the main book by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, which explained this. So going by Parampara system, we can understand Jiva Goswami would not say anything different to our other acharyas, but our other acharyas have explained to us why he has presented this conclusion. So with that, we hear that thus Srila Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, and their nephew Srila Jiva Goswami, as well as practically all of their family members, lived in Vrindavan and published important books on devotional service. So that concludes that section about the bibliography of the various texts that the 6 Goswamis, or at least three of the 6 Goswamis have written. That concludes chapter 1. So we'll start chapter 2 tomorrow. Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur ki, Shri Caitanya Caritamrita ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Putare Srimati Radha Govinda Goswami Namene Namaste Prabhupada Devam Kurmani Vinayane Nirvishesh From Yajana Nishtarine